The investigation into those private emails now heating up. The Democratic presidential hopeful agreeing to hand over that private email server she kept while Secretary of State to the Justice Department now.
Check out her campaign site, and you will still read where Hillary Clinton wants to be a champion to everyday Americans. But in light of news the past 24 hours, she could be a champion for people everywhere seeking to keep themselves out of a federal courtroom. Emails containing top secret material have been found on her personal computer server, despite assertions none were there. The lies or mistruths are piling up, and even her most ardent supporters must begin to wonder if they're being played for fools. Let's get to work. First up, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, former congressman, and author of an interesting editorial in today's New York Post, Pete Hoekstra, joined by former federal prosecutor and author of License to Lie, Sidney Powell. I thank you both for being here. And Peter, I'm going to start with you on that New York Post editorial that you put in there, because here it is, Hillary Clinton's empty excuses on emailing classified info. Now, before I start, I want you to hear this. The State Department deputy spokesperson, Mark Toner, said today that despite 2 of then-Secretary Clinton's emails possibly containing classified information, he says they were not labeled that way when they were sent. Here's what he said.
These emails were not marked as classified at the time they were sent, and both of which they were received, obviously, by Secretary Clinton. They weren't sent by her, but none of them were classified at the time.
But, Pete, let me point out in your editorial today, as you say, you printed rather, the Office of the Inspector General spokesperson Andrea Williams said these emails were classified when they were sent and are classified now. Hey, Pete, somebody's not telling the truth here.
Well, I think you got to, when you start drilling down on this, is the content of the email was classified. It was top secret when it was sent. Let me tell you how this works, and I think this is where people are getting lost in the weeds. I go into a briefing and I get briefed on top secret information. I'm in a secure facility to make sure that no one can eavesdrop. I know that that's a top secret briefing. I leave that room and I go to my email and I send a friend of mine and saying, "You won't believe what I just heard. Country A has seen this in Country B, and they are going to bomb them tomorrow." That's top secret information. I've not asked for any classification. I've sent it out over a regular email system. That is leaking classified information, and that's what we're seeing here with Hillary Clinton. There is no distinction that can be made saying, well, it wasn't labeled as top secret, so she wouldn't have known it, or her staff would not have known it. This thing has so many holes in it. The machine that they're trying to, and the political spin that they're trying to put on has so many holes on it. She's in big trouble, as are her staff.
Sidney, I tell you what, when I was a kid, I remember a book and a movie that was called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. It was about a mob gang in New York City. Jimmy Breslin wrote it, and I don't know why, but every time I read a little bit more here, what we just talked about with Pete, that's what this is. This is the gang that couldn't shoot. They can't even get their story straight these days, Sidney.
They can't get anything straight, Pete, and the State Department and the Department of Justice and the FBI are no better in that regard right now. I mean, they actually left this classified information in the hands of her attorney and didn't even go out to seize the server like they should have. The very fact that this information was on her server in the first place is a violation of the Espionage Act, whether she sent it anywhere else or not, because she wasn't supposed to have that server for official government business at all.
All right, now, you mentioned the violation of the Espionage Act then, Sidney. From your experience and in your opinion, what are we talking about here legally? Let's, as Pete said, let's bore right down to the end result here. Are we looking at a possible investigation that could bring criminal charges against the former Secretary of State?
There certainly should be a criminal investigation into this conduct. We have a number of false statements that she's made to Congress and that Cheryl Mills made to the State Department in her letter, in which she claimed that Ms. Clinton had only used her personal email on occasion or sometimes. Those are both false statements under 18 United States Code Section 1001. There are Espionage Act violations that probably occurred. Those need to be fully investigated. There may be obstruction of justice charges that should be brought or examined under the Sarbanes-Oxley Amendment. There are all kinds of criminal charges that need to be investigated against Ms. Clinton, Ms. Abedin, Ms. Mills, and anyone else involved in this whole affair.
All right, Pete, I'm going to play complete devil's advocate here for a moment. Okay, let's just say, for giggles and grins here, Mrs. Clinton didn't know. This was done by somebody else. She's completely innocent in all this, and you see where I'm going in this. Is that even possible for someone at the level that she held at Secretary of State to be that clueless as to what's going on?
Well, I hope that she would not be that clueless. It's always possible, but highly unlikely. You know, her staff, she herself, they would have gone into lots of briefings where it was very clear these are top secret. These are classified hearings. Be very careful in terms of how you use that information. But, you know, Sidney might have something to add to this. I'm not sure that being ignorant is actually a defense. I don't think it's a defense. Having a server in your house with classified information on it saying, I didn't know, that's not an excuse. That is not a defensible position for her that would protect her from potentially criminal violations or criminal prosecution in the future.
Sidney, I think that's fair, too, because if we're going to talk ignorance, let's talk about a woman who has been in politics almost her entire life, who has been the First Lady of the United States, who has been involved at the highest level of government. Ignorance doesn't count here. It comes down to plain, flat-out lying. If you look at it, that's how people need to see it.
That's exactly how people need to see it, Ed. And on top of that, I believe it was June 2011, she actually sent a memo to other State Department employees telling them to use their official government accounts for official government business. So she can't even claim ignorance if it were an excuse, and it's not. The rules were very clear. She obviously knew what they were, and she specifically chose to avoid them. She chose to do her business on that personal server, and she also chose not to have an inspector general at the State Department during her entire tenure. That person would have been an independent watchdog for the taxpayers overseeing her conduct. And as we know from the current inspector general, in the first 40 emails he examined, he already found these 2 that were top secret and 2 others that likely contain classified information as well.
I have 45 seconds left for both of you. First, Sidney, very briefly, are we looking at the point, are we getting there where the DNC is going to have to say to Mrs. Clinton, it is time for you to get out of the race?
We should be at that point. Whether they have what it takes to do that or not is a whole separate question. But I think the bigger issue is we need a special prosecutor to investigate all of this starting now.
Okay, then, Pete, 30 seconds to you. Special prosecutor, I would imagine that you would agree we are there right now.
We're at a point where we need a special prosecutor to investigate what was going on at the State Department. What the DNC decides to do, that is a political question. What Joe Biden and others decide to do, that's a political question. But obviously they have a leading candidate right now that has major hurdles and some real threats to her candidacy in front of her.
And this really, as the Washington Post said today, just keeps getting worse for Hillary Clinton. If indeed it does, it is something that she has very likely brought on herself. Pete Hoekstra, Sidney Powell, always a pleasure to have you both on the show. Thanks so much. We'll talk again real soon. Coming up next, the political animal, Hillary's second slice of bad news, and the Donald finally talking policy. It's next on the fastest 60 Minutes in News.